Chapter 7. With New Faces to the Highest Places. "I thought you said they were friends," Astrid whispered.
Was Hiccup's best reply. "Maybe they're just really into their roles right now."
Up on stage, after a solid 5 minutes, Bunny and Jack were still fighting with their wooden prop swords. Both were wearing knights' helmet with the visors down, with different colored plumes and capes. From how viciously they were hacking, you'd think that they were really out to murder one another. On top of that, for playing two of the noblest knights in the storybooks, they sure were hurling a lot of insults back and forth. Tooth was off to the side, wearing King Arthur's fake beard and wooden crown. "From dawn till dusk, Sir Yvain and Sir Gawain fought a grim and bloody battle," she repeated for the 10th time in defeat, "with neither of them knowing who they were to each other."
"Maybe we should come back some other time," Hiccup suggested.
"We're already here. We have to make sure we can trust them," Astrid replied, but Hiccup could tell she was equally fascinated by how literally nothing was going right in the show. Their attention was pulled back to the stage by 2 shouts of pain. Jack and Bunny had knocked each other's helmets off at the same time, sending them flying off into the audience. Hiccup and Astrid ducked out of the way, and some poor patron behind them got a full face of metal and plume. Tooth let out a long sigh of relief. She put a hand on her hip and held the other in the air. "In seeing the true identity of their opponent was a close friend," she was cut off by 2 angry grunts. Jack and Bunny had recovered from the impact, skidding to a halt on either side of the stage, glaring at each other.
Hey guys, you're seeing your close friend."
They both raised their swords, holding them like clubs.
"You're supposed to be
Jack and Bunny hollered and charged each other again. It happened so fast that Hiccup almost missed it, distracted by Jack and Bunny's feud. At lightning speed, Tooth threw her sword and bolted across the stage. She leapt off the ground and did a flip over Bunny, pulling his cape over his head. Tooth landed in front of him as he jerked back, striking his sword out of his hands. She caught it out of the air and spun around, swinging both swords at once to meet Jack's. Jack's sword went spinning off into the wings, and he stumbled to a stop as well. When he and Bunny righted themselves, Tooth stepped in between them and pointed her swords at both of their faces. Hiccup glanced over at Astrid to check if she saw the same thing. Her eyes were wide, and she was scowling her rare scowl that meant she was impressed. The last time he saw her look like that was when he beat her at who could drink more meat within 5 minutes and outlasted her at who threw up first afterwards.
"Knights,"
Tooth ordered as Arthur.
"Do you not recognize your most trusted comrade in arms yet?"
Jack and Bunny shot each other seething glares.
"Oh, it's you," Jack muttered. "Gawain, hi."
"Yeah?" Bunny replied.
"And who might you be?"
"I'm Sir Yvain, your greatest friend." Jack stuck his tongue out on the last word, tilting his head back and forth. "For all that you have done for me in the past, I yield this battle to you."
"You shall not do this," Bunny said through gritted teeth. "I hold you so dear, I give you the victory. I accept that I am defeated."
"Here you are."
"Hey now."
"Thus their quarrel came to an end," Tooth interrupted. "For there had been a grave misunderstanding and an unfortunate decision in casting, but thankfully, they both survived the battle. Overcome with joy, they dismounted their horses and held one another in their arms." Tooth lowered their swords and stepped out of the way. Bunny and Jack glared for another beat. Then they both stuck their hands out and awkwardly patted each other on the shoulder at arm's length. Jack pointed his finger in the air. "And kissed," he declared.
"What?"
Bunny did a double take.
"No, we cut that part out."
Jack clasped his hands together and leaned forward, closing his eyes and making loud puckering sounds with his lips. Bunny recoiled so hard that he fell off the side of the stage. Jack cackled and pointed down at him. "What happened to, 'It's crucial to play the story accurate,' Bunny?"
"And you thought these people could be spies,"
Hiccup whispered to Astrid.
"Or they're really good at acting like bad actors,"
Astrid whispered back. "You saw what Tooth just did." Tooth, meanwhile, was trying to salvage what was left of the show.
"Ah, Sir Yvain and Sir Gawain,"
she shouted over Jack's laughter while elbowing him.
"'Tis I, King Arthur. I have bore witness to both your battle and your friendship."
Jack hummed. They sounded like more than friends based on what I read.
"You can read?"
Bunny piped up. Tooth had to push Jack back before it could lunge off the stage at him.
"This is why you guys never play enemy roles," she whispered.
Tooth gave the audience a strained smile while struggling against him. As king, I will settle the dispute between the two sisters who asked you to fight as their champions in the first place. She grabbed Jack and Bunny's wrists, leaning down to reach the ladder. Give me your hands. There. I declare that both of you will receive honor in this battle. Jack whooped and pumped his fist into the air. Tooth, who was much shorter than Jack and still holding his wrist, was swung off her feet. She shrieked and flailed, smacking Jack across the face by accident. The two of them crashed on top of each other on the stage, groaning in pain. Hiccup side-eyed Astrid, raising his brows. Astrid pressed her lips into a thin line in response. Sandy ran out on stage from the wings, carrying an armful of puppets. He was wearing the lion's mane, with painted whiskers and a dot on his nose. He poked Jack and Tooth with his foot to get their attention, then flung the puppets away, scattering them across the back of the stage. Tooth lifted her head off the ground and made a bunch of miscellaneous panic crowd sounds, such as, "Ah, a wild beast has smelt the spilt blood," and "Flee for your lives," and "No, Eleanor, it's not a cat, don't pet it." Jack didn't bother moving, other than sticking his arms up and waving. "No, don't worry about the lion," he deadpanned. "He's friendly." Bunny put his head in his arms on the stage, smacking the ground to stifle his laughter. "It's him," he choked out. "Sir Yvain is also the Knight of the Lion. Sorry, mate. Wouldn't have tried as hard to kill you if I knew." The audience cheered. Hiccup and Astrid hesitantly clapped a few times to be polite. Tooth rolled off of Jack's back and sat up to deliver the closing speech, pulling off the fake beard to give the audience a cheery smile. "Thus Yvain and Gawain were reunited at long last. Theirs was a tale of true love and honor. Though both hid their identities in the fight, their equal will to defend the innocent is what saved them from destroying one another in the end. And as they removed their armor to tend to their injuries, the lion snuggled close to Yvain, licking his wounds to try to heal his dear, best friend." Sandy sat down next to Jack and gently patted him on his head. Jack reached up and patted Sandy on the head back. The audience collectively cooed. Tooth threw her arms open in welcome at the crowd. "My name is Tooth, and these are Sandy, Bunny, and Jack Frost. Thank you for your patronage. We hope you enjoyed the show." The audience cheered one more time before dispersing, leaving Hiccup and Astrid as the last two spectators. Tooth spotted Hiccup first and gasped in delight. "Hi, Hiccup. It's so good to see you again." Jack finally sat up at that. His eyes lit up when he saw Hiccup. He grinned and vaulted off the stage, jogging up to them. "Hiccup? Astrid?" He nodded to them both. Hiccup smiled back at him. "Good to see you, Jack." Before they could say anything else, Tooth zipped up to Astrid, who took a step back in surprise. "Hello, Astrid. It's wonderful to meet you," she beamed, holding out her hand up to Astrid's face. Astrid's eyes flickered between it and Tooth's smile. Hiccup recognized Astrid's current scowl as one of surprise rather than anger. The differences were subtle, and it had taken him at least 1 or 2 years to be able to read them. However, it didn't seem to deter Tooth at all. "Yeah, good to meet you too," Astrid said slowly. She hesitantly took Tooth's hand, which was swallowed by Astrid's, especially with her leather gloves on. She gave it a small shake, making Tooth smile wider. Hiccup knew her caution was more than warranted. 2 times now he had witnessed what Tooth was capable of, and only brief glimpses at that. Even so, the sight of Astrid eyeing this tiny bouncing ball of color and joy no taller than her shoulders was hilarious, and he couldn't hold back his grin. Judging by Jack's smile, he was probably thinking the same thing. Hiccup had forgotten how short Tooth was too, especially next to both him and Astrid. It was interesting to compare everyone's heights now that the bards were coming down from their stage, and Astrid wasn't riding Stormfly. Jack and Astrid he knew were the same height, while Hiccup was roughly about Bunny's height, like Jack had said. This was the first time he had gotten a good look at Sandy out from behind the curtain. He was barely taller than Hiccup's waist. Sandy gave them a cheerful wave before shaking both of their hands. Jack laughed. "I'm sure you just heard, but that's Tooth," he said, gesturing to each of his friends in turn. "That's Sandy, and the cocky-looking one coming over is Cottontail." Bunny walked up behind Jack and shoved Jack's feathered hat on his head, cutting him off. He smiled lopsidedly. "Bunny, pleasure to make both your acquaintances." Bunny gave them both firm handshakes as well. Tooth, Bunny, and Sandy, huh? Those were oddly specific names. Hiccup couldn't judge them, though. They weren't nearly as weird as some of the Burkian ones he knew. Bunny looked Hiccup up and down, raising a brow. The shirt doesn't look half bad on you. Hiccup glanced down, shifting the collar up.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate you letting me borrow it.
Bunny smiled again. Keep it. Then you won't have to worry about getting it dirty while working. Hiccup gave him a grateful smile.
Thank you.
They were interrupted by Tooth's chattering voice a few feet away. Astrid was looking between all the bards, probably wondering what hidden abilities Bunny and Sandy had, but she was periodically distracted by Tooth bombarding her with questions. She had noticed Astrid's sword and was gushing about how pristine she kept it. Eventually she convinced Astrid to draw it, much to Bunny's dismay. Despite his best efforts to hide it, he became increasingly stressed as Tooth stuck her face closer and closer to it. Finally, Bunny yelped and ran over when Tooth was about to line her eye up with the tip of the blade. Hiccup doubted Tooth was winning them any trust points with how knowledgeable of sword fighting she was showing herself to be. At the same time, he noticed a hint of a smile growing on Astrid's face the more they talked. He felt a tug on his cloak and looked down to see Sandy smiling at him. He looked oddly sleepy, despite it barely being noon, giving Hiccup a slow blink. Hiccup made the mistake of blinking back and missed the first several hand gestures Sandy ran through. He did his best to keep up.
Me and Jack, good? Not good. Yes, good. Great, even? Great. Standing together is great?
Sandy paused, realizing Hiccup wasn't used to this way of communication yet. He reached into his satchel, and Hiccup caught a view of small puppets and props. After rummaging around a bit, Sandy pulled out a notebook and pencil, jotting something down. He held up the page to Hiccup, who had to bend down to read it.
Thanks for being Jack's only friend.
Jack, who had been watching the scene in amusement the whole time, suddenly jumped forward in panic. "Oh, okay," Jack exclaimed, stepping in between him and Sandy. He gave Hiccup a strained grin while waving off Sandy behind him. "Thank you, Sandy. I think he got it before." That finally cracked a laugh out of Astrid. She sheathed her sword, mindful to give Tooth a warning nod beforehand. "All right, I'll leave you guys to it," Astrid relented. "I need to go back and make sure the squires haven't murdered each other." "You have squires?" Tooth gasped. Astrid smiled at that. "Not quite. I'm just playing babysitter for the knights who do." "Oh, then we'd love to meet them too. You should invite them for a show sometime."
"Absolutely not,"
Hiccup and Astrid said at the same time. That finally surprised Tooth, who brought her hands together, pursing her lips. Hiccup chuckled.
"Believe me, you don't want that," he said. "If you value your sanity, that is."
Bunny side-eyed Jack. "Some of us more than others." Jack narrowed his eyes and gave him that elfish grin in response. Hiccup deadpanned.
"I can imagine."
"Yeah, good luck with that," Astrid said, patting Hiccup on the shoulder. She turned to Jack and Tooth. "I cleared your names out of the report, but try to keep a low profile in case anyone recognizes you." Astrid departed afterwards, but only after Tooth made a promise to come back to chat again. That was definitely a smile Hiccup caught as she turned away. Jack nudged Hiccup. "Is that Astrid speak for I trust you now?"
"If you add not to try anything dumb, yeah," Hiccup chuckled. "So, did you manage to buy all the parts I wrote down for you?"
Jack grinned. "Every last one." Jack did not buy the right parts. In fact, he missed every single part that Hiccup had written down for him, even with all the accompanying sketches that Hiccup had painstakingly drawn up. When Hiccup asked how he managed to even do that, Jack had replied with a shrug and an, it's all metal anyway. From there it was obvious that Hiccup would have to go back with him to show him where everything was, even if they ran the risk of being recognized as a pair. Hiccup had been against it, but Jack insisted on following through with his promise to help him. Tooth had jumped in, offering to come with them as well in support. Sandy had backed her up, and the two of them eventually rode Bunny into the field trip, and even then it was only because they pointed out that, in Bunny's words, they didn't trust Jack not to bugger up and cause another scene. Jack assured him that he hadn't told the others about Toothless, but Hiccup worried that letting them help would raise more questions about his plan. But with the ever-looming approach of the outsiders, he was too short on time to turn down the extra help. The benefits of expediting the building process were too great not to take the chance. To keep a low profile, the bards changed into their work clothes again, leaving their feathered hats back at the inn. Much to Jack's satisfaction, it seemed. The outfits all consisted of worn brown pants and boots, with everyone wearing simple shirts. Jack was back in his blue shirt, while Tooth and Bunny were in white, and Sandy's were the warm yellow.
"I guess these are our crime clothes now, too," Jack said, smiling elfishly at Bunny. Bunny glared back, rubbing his forehead as if a headache was already forming. "Please don't call them crime clothes."
"We're not committing any crimes," Hiccup agreed. "We're still paying for the parts. We just need to do it while staying out of sight."
"Seems easy enough," Jack replied.
"Maybe for us," Bunny said. "But you and Tooth both have bounties on your heads, not to mention anyone caught with His Highness gets a ticket straight to the dungeons."
"Just Hiccup is fine," Hiccup said. "And to be fair, those aren't hard to get in Berg."
"Well, ain't that just aces?"
"Don't worry, Bunny," Tooth chimed in. "Astrid cleared our names already. Plus, all we have to do is make sure we don't make fools of ourselves like Jack. Hey, and don't make it look like we're kidnapping Hiccup."
Hiccup smiled. Tooth's enthusiasm was infectious. Despite Astrid's apprehension, he was already growing fond of her. In fact, he was getting more comfortable around all of Jack's friends, even if they were some of the weirdest people he had ever met. And that was saying something considering Hiccup's own friend group, and they had to be literally forced together. Between Tooth's hyperactivity, Sandy's sage-like demeanor, and Bunny's grumpy voice of reason, until he developed into a bickering kid whenever Jack opened his mouth, the more time Hiccup spent with them, the more he was both endeared and confused by how this bizarre mix of people ever banded together in the first place.
"And I thought Jack was the weird... Well, never mind, actually. In any case, it's better to stay on the safe side," Hiccup said. "Keep an eye out for any wanted posters you might..."
Sandy tugged on Hiccup's cloak, and the entire group stopped. He pointed at a large paper hanging on a wall. "Oh, here we go," muttered Bunny.
"I hope they captured my essence," Jack grinned.
"You can't capture the smell of rotten gremlin on paper."
"Actually, you can if you smear some..."
Tooth elbowed Jack at the same time that Sandy poked his side before he could finish that sentence. It made Jack snicker, and the two of them rolled their eyes fondly. Hiccup smiled to himself. At the same time, it made sense that the four of them would stay together too. But as they walked closer to the poster, they saw that, surprisingly, it wasn't one for Jack. It depicted a certain other person with bright eyes and a cheerful smile. Hiccup read the text. "Wanted. Tiny woman, roughly armpit height, long dark hair, indigo-colored eyes. Crimes: destruction of property, disturbing the peace, and causing public deprivation of mead." It seemed that Astrid wasn't aware of the list of Tooth's other crimes that needed to be wiped from the report.
"I can get Astrid to clear those charges too," Hiccup reassured them, "but she won't be able to get to it until tomorrow."
Bunny rubbed his temples.
"Her eyes are a dead giveaway,"
Hiccup grimaced.
"People are most likely going to remember her for the meat."
"And whose idea was that?"
Tooth asked. Everyone looked pointedly at Jack. Jack held up his hands.
"Hey, I was just making it up as I went."
Sandy sent Jack an unimpressed look before running through more hand gestures. Hiccup was starting to pick up on them, but he only caught something about Jack's head. Jack held a hand to his chest.
"You wound me, Sandy."
"Never mind that now,"
Hiccup said. He pulled the sketches of the parts out of his satchel.
"Sandy, do you think you can recognize these from the drawings?"
Sandy nodded, and Hiccup handed them over.
"Okay, here's the plan. We'll split up into teams. Sandy can go with Bunny, and Jack, you'll come with me. Tooth, you stay on the rooftops and keep a lookout for the guards. First sign of trouble, we'll call it a day and leave."
The others nodded, and they headed out. Bunny and Sandy got into the flow of things fairly quickly, meeting up with Hiccup every so often to double-check if they had the right parts and for directions on where to find the next. Jack and Hiccup had to be more cautious in case either of them were recognized after their escape the other day. Their process consisted of sneaking through the less crowded pathways and Hiccup directing Jack over to the booths to make the purchases while he stayed hidden in the shadows. Hiccup kept an eye out for Tooth above them the whole time. Every so often, she would flag down their attention. With a few quick hand signals, she'd alert them of any oncoming guards and which direction to head in to avoid them. And Hiccup checked in with her often, given how easily distracted Jack was by everything around him. The marketplace was busy as ever in the mid-afternoon, loud with the sounds of bartering and trade, with horse-drawn wagons still hauling in crates of goods from the merchant ships. Above them, at staggering heights, people were even trading by passing goods along a network of pulleys between buildings and up from the ground level. Colorful cloth awnings hung over them across the streets, shading them from the sun. Many of them had caught autumn leaves that would sometimes blow down over the square when the sea breeze passed by. Giant Burkians intermingled with foreigners of all shapes and sizes, including children, much to Jack's delight. All around them, children were sweeping the leaves up into piles to jump into. Between watching them play and the adults trading around them, Jack had to be pulled out of the way by Hiccup before he could be trampled every few steps. No wonder he missed everything on the list. Hiccup felt like he should have been more irritated than he was, but it was hard to stay mad at Jack when his laughter was so infectious every time it happened. He was smiling so wide at the sides that Hiccup found himself gaining a new appreciation for them as well. So while he tried to keep them on task, Hiccup admittedly might have led them down a few detours to see other parts of the market, pleased whenever a particular sight made Jack's hazel eyes light up. At one point they took a break when a child recognized Jack from one of his shows. Hiccup stepped back to hide in the shade and watched him play with a group of kids, both Burkian and foreign. He smiled to himself while listening to Jack laugh, his brows knitting together in thought. Out of all the bards, Jack seemed to be the one who was the least traveled, making Hiccup wonder how recently he had joined the troupe. Considering how disgruntled Jack looked on stage in contrast to how much fun he was having now, Hiccup had to wonder why he had joined to begin with. Maybe it had something to do with the children. In any case, he made a note to himself to show Jack as much of the city as he could before he left. Hiccup noticed that they were setting up the large royal banners along the main streets, along with baskets of confetti that would be released at the same time they were officially unfurled. Those were meant to welcome the knights home whenever a large party of them came to the city. As much as Hiccup had always loved the sight of them as a child, he dreaded what they meant for Berg this time. His dad must have upped the number of patrols in anticipation for their arrival as well. There were guards posted on nearly every busy street. Hiccup checked the position of the sun. It might be time to tell everyone to call it a day. Speaking of which, he hadn't checked in with Tooth for a while. He glanced up at the rooftops. She was gone. Hiccup whipped his head around and tried not to panic. He scanned the buildings around them for any sign of her, to no luck. He must have lost her a while back after getting too distracted showing Jack around. When he couldn't find her, he moved to signal for Jack to come over, only to see a group of guards walking towards him from the same direction. Spinning around on his heel, he walked away as fast as he could, without drawing attention to himself, securing his hood over his head. He would have to find Jack again later. Hiccup searched the tops of buildings, windowsills, awnings, and anywhere that he could possibly find Tooth as he walked. Without her, he had no way of alerting the others that it was time to leave. He was so caught up looking for her that he ended up tripping over Sandy.
"Oh, sorry, Sandy. I didn't see you there."
Sandy nodded.
"Have you seen Tooth?"
Sandy shook his head. He pointed a finger in the air, spinning it in a horizontal circle. Then he brought the hand over his head, flicking his fingers like a tuft of hair. He raised a brow and pushed up the corners of his mouth with his fingers into an elfish smile.
"I lost him somewhere back at the center of the market. Where's Bunny?"
Sandy saw something behind Hiccup and pointed. Hiccup made the mistake of looking behind him, making direct eye contact with the guard. He turned back around and saw Sandy facepalm. He must have been trying to warn him. Sandy spun Hiccup and pushed him in a different direction, shooing him to hurry. Hiccup didn't question it, dashing down the street.
"Your Highness, wait!"
called the guard. The market-goers who heard him started looking around, searching their surroundings for Hiccup as well. Hiccup cursed inwardly, pulling his hood all the way over his head as he ran, only to crash into Bunny after turning a corner, the collision almost sending Hiccup toppling to the ground. Guess Sandy had answered his question after all. Bunny steadied Hiccup before he could fall. "You good there?"
"Fine, yeah,"
Hiccup replied absently, still looking around above them.
"Have you seen Tooth anywhere?"
Bunny shook his head. "I haven't seen her for the last half hour. Why?"
"I've been spotted. It's time to go."
Bunny cursed. "Where are the others?" They heard the guards' voices getting closer before Hiccup could answer. "Give me your cloak," Bunny said. Hiccup complied, and Bunny fastened it over his shoulders. Pulling the hood down, he went back down the street Hiccup had come from. Hiccup heard the guards run over to him. "Everything all right?" Bunny asked casually. "Sorry, sir. We're looking for someone more fishbone-sized." "Of course."
No worries, mate, Bunny replied, and Hiccup could hear the smirk in his voice. Hiccup sighed. He turned and crept in the opposite direction. It was lucky that out of everyone in the group, he ran into the one person who was the same height as him just in time. Jack probably could have made a convincing enough double as well, though. Speaking of which, he should go find him. Hiccup made his way back to the main area, making sure to stay low and hide behind the booths. He scanned the marketplace for that signature tuft of brown hair. It popped in from the corner of his eye. Jack was perched on a windowsill over a pastry stand, hidden behind the awning, and was popping in and out from behind it, alternating between snapping up cookies and dropping money into the strongbox. He must have been doing it just for the fun of it. Jack saw Hiccup as well, sticking the cookie he had just swiped into his mouth to wave. Hiccup deadpanned at him.
"Your Highness, what are you doing here?"
Hiccup froze. The baker was staring wide-eyed at him. He had been so distracted by Jack that he had stood up straight, out from behind the booth. The baker followed Hiccup's gaze and turned, gasping when she saw Jack.
"Thief!"
The baker reached under the table and pulled out her axe. Unable to plead his case with his mouth full, Jack popped back behind the awning, abandoning Hiccup behind him. Hiccup reached for his hood, only to remember that he had given his cloak to Bunny.
"He's over here!"
A guard had seen him as well, and he waved at the others to follow. Hiccup turned and sprinted down the street. He heard tiles clatter from above and saw Jack running across the rooftops alongside him. Jack leaned down and held his hand out. Hiccup surveyed the area in front of him and saw a wagon by the side of the road. Using it as a ramp, he ran up and leapt the last few feet towards Jack, planting his foot on the edge of the roof. Jack caught his arm before he could fall back, but something tugged at him in the opposite direction. Hiccup looked behind him to see that the guard had caught the strap of his satchel. The guard saw Jack as well, and Hiccup saw him squint at the familiar face. He couldn't let Jack be recognized with him again. With no other choice, Hiccup unclasped his satchel and let it fall along with the guard. The guard tumbled down the wagon, and the others stopped to help him up. Jack took the opportunity to pull Hiccup around the corner and out of sight. Hiccup heard the captain's voice, and his stomach dropped. He went to go back, but Jack tugged him by his arm.
"It's okay. The others have enough,"
Jack said. Hiccup shook his head.
"No, that's not the problem. They're going to start questioning people if they see anyone buy those materials. It's going to lead them back to all of you."
Jack's eyes widened, but he held him in place.
"We'll get it back."
Hiccup shook his head.
"No time. You have to dump the supplies before they can find you. I'll draw them off."
"What about your friend? How are you going to get him home if they find out what you're making?" Hiccup bit his lip, but he shook his head again. This was his mess. He would figure that out by himself.
"He's not the one I'm worried about right now. Go tell the others to get rid of the evidence."
"I'm not leaving you." Hiccup met Jack's eyes. All signs of humor were gone, replaced with a fierce determination. Hiccup was taken aback by how serious he looked, but they didn't have time for that. He yanked his arm out of Jack's grip.
"Find the others. Hurry."
"Hiccup!" Jack called after him. Staying on the rooftops, Hiccup ran back into the guard's view, pausing to make sure they saw him before running away. He hoped that Jack had enough sense not to follow him. He couldn't look back to check. He was already too preoccupied doing his best not to slip and fall off the angled rooftops. Now that Jack wasn't guiding him, he had to focus twice as hard not to trip on a loose tile, and it took him twice as long to jump between the gaps in buildings. The guards were catching up to him quickly, shouting pleas for him to come back. Hiccup saw some of them pass his satchel to the captain to inspect. Hiccup looked around him for another distraction. At this height, all that was in front of him were the signs on the street. And the baskets of confetti for the knights. Hiccup ran until he got to one of the central release cords, gripping it in both hands. He tugged hard, ripping open the baskets all at once and sending the papers flying into the air, blown even higher by the wind. He jumped from one central cord to another, repeating the same process until the sky was filled with bright colors. The people on the street looked up at the confetti in confusion, some beginning to cheer when they mistook it as a sign that the knights had returned. More people ran outside to see what the commotion was about, slowing the guards as they had to weave around them. Thinking fast, Hiccup jumped off the edge of the roof he was on and grabbed onto the cloth of one of the banners, which unfurled under his weight, triggering the others along the street to release as well. Once it unfurled all the way, Hiccup managed to keep his grip at the recoil, dropping safely to the ground. Upon seeing the banners with Berg's royal crest, the crowd celebration of the knight's return began in full, blocking more of the guard's path. Hiccup breathed a sigh of relief.
He turned to run into the alley, just as Bunny rounded the corner and crashed into him, the force of which sent Hiccup tumbling to the ground. Bunny cursed and helped him up. "Are you trying to make a habit out of this?"
"I haven't reached that level of masochism yet,"
Hiccup muttered in reassurance, although he wasn't sure how true that was, given recent events.
"How did you find me?"
"Jack's playing lookout, but he's no Tooth. Where is that bugger?" It was Hiccup's turn to curse. Of course Jack was still trying to help him. It seemed that he had found a new rival in stubbornness.
"Here, give me my cloak and go dump the supplies,"
Hiccup said. Bunny did a take. "What?"
"This was my mistake. The guards have my satchel and know what we've been buying and who to ask for, but I can draw them off while you guys get rid of the evidence and run."
Bunny's brows furrowed. "Then won't they know how to find you?"
"That doesn't matter."
Bunny regarded Hiccup with an unreadable expression. Hiccup heard the guards approaching from both ends. He frantically looked around for an exit, but all the sides of the buildings facing them were nothing but flat stone walls.
"Hurry,"
Hiccup said.
"You have to get out of—"
"How much do you weigh?" Hiccup froze. Bunny wasn't looking at him anymore, he was looking up. Hiccup followed his gaze to one building that was a bit shorter than the ones around it, but not short enough.
"Oh no."
Hiccup took a step back, holding his hands out in front of him.
Don't worry about it. You go on ahead. I'll just give up and turn myself in now."
Someone whistled above them. Jack had found him again and was standing on the roof, gesturing towards himself with both hands. Hiccup looked back at Bunny.
"Too much," he answered. "Too much for him. No, wait.
Bunny grabbed him by the waist and hoisted him over his shoulder like a rag doll. With a grunt, he flung him up into the air. Hiccup couldn't stop the loud shriek that escaped him, and he heard the guards call out his location. Jack lunged forward and grabbed his arm, and Hiccup found himself back in a very familiar situation. He was probably going to have to get used to this routine if he was going to hang around Jack more. Just as Jack nearly lost his grasp, Tooth popped out over the edge of the roof and grabbed Hiccup's other arm with both hands. With her help, Jack was able to adjust his grip, and they clumsily pulled Hiccup up just as the guards were coming into view. "There he is!" one of them yelled. It was the captain. Hiccup heard scuffling sounds between the guards and where Bunny was.
"We have to go back for him,"
Hiccup said, still out of breath. He tried to look over the rooftop, but Jack and Tooth held him back. There were more shouts from the guards, and a minute later Bunny vaulted over the other side of the roof to join them, wearing the hood of the cloak again. Hiccup huffed a sigh of relief, slumping back down on the tiles.
"Are you guys okay?"
Tooth asked. "Where the bloody hell were you?" Bunny demanded. Jack side-eyed her with an amused grin, and Tooth winced, laughing bashfully and wringing her hands.
"I saw some Burkian kids fist-fighting in the middle of the street, as Burkian kids do, it seems, considering no one stepped in to stop them. And I was about to turn a blind eye, but then I saw one of the girls got 2 whole baby teeth knocked out, and she took it like a champ."
She was talking so rapidly that Hiccup felt like she was pelting them with words.
"She spat them out and was about to throw them away, so I thought, hey, if she doesn't want them, I'll take them off her hands."
Tooth pulled out a pouch from her pocket, turning it upside down and dropping set teeth into her palm. Hiccup stared at them in partial shock and partial horror.
"You went and picked her bloody teeth off the ground?"
Hiccup stammered.
"No."
Tooth drew out the word, waving his question off good-naturedly.
"I bought them from her."
Hiccup did a take.
"You paid for her teeth?"
"Of course."
"Why?"
"It's ethical."
"No, that's not what I meant."
Hiccup turned to Jack and Bunny for answers, but neither of them were any help. Jack was laughing at Hiccup's bewilderment, holding his fist in his mouth to stifle it. Meanwhile, Bunny was shooting Tooth an exasperated look and rubbing one of his temples again. This must have been normal for her. That both answered and raised more questions about her name. Hiccup wondered what would happen if she ever met Toothless and saw him retract his teeth. He shivered. Tooth held one of them up to admire it.
"Look how well she brushed."
Hiccup had no idea how she could tell because
"There's still blood on it."
"Oh, it'll just need a little wipe." "Find the imposter who took him," the captain yelled. Bunny cursed. He crouched lower on the roof, gesturing for them to do the same. "There won't be any toothbrushes in the dungeons," he hissed. Shame built up in Hiccup's chest. He dragged a hand down his face.
"This is all my fault. I couldn't even stop myself from screaming and giving us away."
Bunny smirked. "Oh, I was counting on that." He took off the cloak, revealing Hiccup's satchel secured by his side. Hiccup's mouth fell open.
"How did you—"
"I figured if they thought I was you, they'd let me get close enough to nick it back." Bunny winked, handing Hiccup both the satchel and cloak. "Don't give up just yet." The shame in Hiccup was blown away by the sheer level of gratitude he felt at that moment. His eyes started stinging. Unable to find the right words, Hiccup swallowed and took the items, nodding in thanks. Jack smiled at Hiccup as well, with a strange look in his eyes. When Hiccup met his gaze, the look was gone just as quickly as it had come. Jack raised a brow and nudged Bunny. "Looks like these are crime clothes after all." Bunny's smile dropped. "And they're about to be dungeon clothes," he retorted. Guards were patrolling every street around them, questioning passerbys, even without the materials. Hiccup and the others would be too visible if they stood up to run. There was no other choice. Hiccup slung his satchel over his shoulder and fastened his cloak again.
"Jack, where's Sandy?"
Jack pointed him out. Sandy was standing by another booth, calmly shopping for more supplies. Hiccup waved to get his attention. Sandy looked up, and Hiccup saw him tilt his head when he noticed everyone else was with him. Hiccup pointed at the booth he was in front of and made a wide sweeping motion with his arms. Sandy deadpanned, and Hiccup could see him roll his eyes from the distance. He flipped the table over, knocking over all the goods onto the ground, sending some crates that were beside it tumbling over as well. Jack burst out laughing, and Tooth and Bunny both had to shush him. The guards in the square instantly converged on Sandy. He waved at them to run, then neatly hopped up his makeshift staircase to the top of the other building. Now everyone's hands had been stained red.
"That shit's gonna kill me." "Go!"
Hiccup called. Jack took Hiccup's hand, and the four of them bolted across the rooftops out of sight, their escape covered by crashing wares, cheering crowds, and the falling colors of confetti. Jack was laughing all the while. "Looks like everyone got a crime in today," Jack said as they made their way back to the inn. "I wouldn't be so chipper. Yours was completely avoidable," Bunny replied, glaring when Jack snickered.
"In any case, Astrid will clear it up for you guys,"
Hiccup assured them.
"Don't worry."
That got a crooked smile out of Bunny. He bumped Hiccup's arm. "I wasn't," he replied, and Hiccup smiled back gratefully. "You did win for worst crime committed, though," Jack added, flashing Bunny his elfish grin. Bunny deadpanned. He met Hiccup's gaze. "It's a death sentence for that, right?" Hiccup nodded. Bunny nodded back. Hiccup paused. Hiccup shook his head. Bunny nodded more.
"Ooh, Hiccup," Tooth cut in. "Make sure to remind Astrid to bring her teeth the next time she visits."
Hiccup sputtered.
"Her teeth?" "Not her own teeth. The teeth she knocks out when she punches someone. She keeps those? She said she would next time."
Hiccup opened and closed his mouth a few times, unsure which part he should be more unnerved by.
"Oh, yeah, sure."
Tooth laughed. When she looked back up at him, there was a new gentleness in her eyes, their indigo alight in the sun. She glanced behind her, then reached up and put her hand on Hiccup's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. Hiccup was taken aback by the warmth in her smile.
"For the teeth?"
Tooth didn't answer. Bunny and Jack were bickering behind them, and Tooth's head tilted as she listened. She hopped back and joined in on the conversation. Sandy had been contentedly watching the whole scene up until then. Hiccup had seen him yawn a few times too, so he was surprised when Sandy poked his arm right as Tooth left. Sandy took something out of his satchel and handed it to Hiccup. Hiccup let out a breath in awe. Sandy had given Hiccup his sketches of the supplies back, and he had taken the time to draw a detailed map of the entire marketplace to go with them, marking all the locations for where to find them. He must have made it in anticipation for Jack to make more shopping trips. There was a small note in the corner. "To help you two stay out of trouble." Sandy smiled. He held up his pencil to Hiccup too, who raised his brows.
"Are you sure?"
Sandy nodded, and Hiccup took the pencil from him. He turned it around in his hand. There was a subtle gold-colored spiral detail running along the sides. He had never seen one so finely crafted, even from the foreign merchants. Hiccup grinned.
"Thank you."
Sandy shook his head. Making sure to go at a slower pace for Hiccup, he pointed at him with one hand, then at Jack with the other. Jack was too busy laughing to notice the rich sound resonating in the air. Hiccup didn't realize he was staring until Sandy waved for his attention. Sandy brought his two fingers to stand next to each other, then clasped his hands together, shaking them in thanks. Hiccup felt a smile soften, and he nodded.
"I'm happy to be."
Jack couldn't have asked for a better ending to their day out. After saying goodbye to the other bards, Hiccup toured Jack around the nearby area to the inn. It was getting closer to the evening, so the streets were less crowded, making it safer for them to walk around unnoticed.
Hiccup had a huge smile on his face the entire time, and Jack could feel his relief, making him grin as well. As they walked, Hiccup told him stories about where he had to hide from guards and where he had been caught. Jack, in turn, took note of all the good climbing spots in case they needed to make another quick escape. He laughed when the blood drained out of Hiccup's face at the suggestion and offered to help him practice. Eventually, they found a building that had a good view of the city and was easy enough for Hiccup to try and scale on his own. Jack helped him pull up the last few stones, and they took a seat together to watch the sunset.
"What are you looking at?"
Hiccup asked after a while. "The castle."
"Sure is big, huh?"
Jack hummed. "I'm trying to figure out how I'd climb it."
"Of course you are,"
Hiccup chuckled.
"I wouldn't try it, though. The last time I stepped outside the outer walls through the passages, I barely jumped back in time to dodge 20 arrows and 3 spears.
"Well, now you've just challenged me." Jack smirked, laughing when Hiccup looked genuinely alarmed. Hiccup rolled his eyes, and Jack elbowed him. "You could save yourself the headache and invite me in." Hiccup raised a brow.
"We could use a court jester, but you'd have to wear the jingly shoes, I'm afraid."
Jack scrunched up his nose. "Disgusting." He grinned when that got Hiccup to laugh. "Which one's your room?"
"All the way up there."
Hiccup pointed to the tallest tower. It was high up enough to where the sun was in the sky. Jack squinted and could just make out the shape of a small window.
"It used to be a watchtower, but they let me turn it into a bedroom when they realized no enemies would ever make it that far without getting shot down."
Jack hummed again appreciatively. "No kidding. That's got to be an insane amount of stairs to climb."
"You have no idea, but it's worth it."
Hiccup closed his eyes and took a deep breath, opening them up to the clouds.
"It's the closest I can get to the sky."
A rush of excitement filled Jack's chest. The same feeling from when Hiccup had first told him about his glider. Even if the project was meant to help his friend, his longing to take flight was clearly just as strong. For the first time in almost 3 winters, Jack allowed himself to think back on his days spent climbing up that pine tree on the hills of Hawthorne. All the time spent dreaming of being swept high up by the wind. All the time spent with... He stopped his thoughts, focusing on the simple joy he felt in the moment with Hiccup. He had found a kindred spirit. He held himself back from gushing all of that out loud, opting instead to give him the simplest reply that he hoped still conveyed his feelings. For now. Judging by Hiccup's huge smile, it did. Hiccup pulled out a sketchbook and the pencil Sandy had given him, then absently began to draw. Jack leaned over to watch, smiling when he saw that it was the start of a dragon.
"Your friends are fun,"
Hiccup said after a beat. He turned the pencil around in his hand again to admire it, a small smile on his face. Jack's expression softened. He had no doubts that the other bards would take an immediate liking to Hiccup. "They think you're fun, too," Jack raised a brow. "How does Astrid feel about them?"
"She'll warm up to you guys,"
Hiccup assured him.
"Although I think Tooth's already done a good amount of warming. I see what you meant about her in personal space."
Jack snickered, remembering the shock on Astrid's face when Tooth had run up to her. Admittedly, he had been concerned if Astrid would instinctively draw her sword on her, but he didn't doubt that Tooth would have dodged it just as fast. He had never seen Tooth wield a real sword either, but she was clearly knowledgeable about them. Jack wondered what would happen if they tried to spar. "It is hard to get rid of her once she's set her sights on making friends with you," he agreed.
"Seems like it. What's the deal with her and Teeth, though?"
"Not sure. I never asked."
"Why not?"
Jack shrugged. "I don't ask questions about them, and they don't ask any about me." Hiccup paused, looking up at Jack.
"Why's that?"
he asked again. Jack sighed through his nose, shaking his head. "It's better for everyone that way." He could tell his answer made Hiccup even more curious, but he took the hint not to push Jack further. Hiccup nodded.
"I guess I can't judge you for keeping secrets."
He hesitated, looking at Jack out of the corner of his eye.
"Thank you for today. And yesterday."
Jack smiled reassuringly. He bumped Hiccup's shoulder with his. "You should get going, if you want to visit him tonight, too." Hiccup gave his toothy grin.
"I can afford to stay a bit longer."
Jack grinned too, and they sat in silent companionship for a while. Jack was the next one to speak again. "Once you get your friend back home, where else are you going to take the glider?" Hiccup shook his head.
"I don't know if I can leave the kingdom just like that."
"You've never thought about seeing more of the world?"
"When don't I think about it? But I need to make sure my home is safe first."
Hiccup looked to the mountains.
"And stop this war before it starts."
Does that have something to do with dragons? Hiccup looked up in surprise. Jack nodded to his sketches. You seem pretty sympathetic to them, despite the legends in Burke's history. Hiccup let out a breath. He put his sketchbook away, crossing his arms over his knees. He looked up at the dragon flags and thought.
Lately, I've been thinking about how much history we're missing from the other side. If they did exist, were they really the monsters that the stories made them out to be? Maybe instead of mindlessly killing each other, we could have lived alongside them and learned from them. If we found a way to make peace with them back then, maybe we would know how to make peace with the outsiders now.
Jack tilted his head. Peace seems really important to you. Hiccup looked away.
Yeah, it's not very fitting for a Prince of Burke, huh?
There was that same expression Jack had seen during their first conversation. The one that weighed down on Hiccup so heavily that it made him look small. He wasn't meeting Jack's eyes, his own gaze unfocused on anything outside of himself. Jack knew it all too well. He looked lonely. No, but it fits you. Hiccup didn't look up at first, but his eyes widened until they were round. He faced Jack again, searching for any sign of lies. Slowly but surely, that same joyful, hiccupy grin lit up across his features. Out of all the smiles Jack had seen from him today, this was the one that he had been hoping to bring out the most. The one from back at the forge, where Hiccup felt the most himself, and from under the glider, where he had felt the most trusting, the most hopeful. Jack gave him a warm smile back. There, that suits you much better. He bumped Hiccup's shoulder again. Where would you want to go, if you could? Hiccup shrugged, a new amusement in his eyes.
Where wouldn't I go? I'd start past the mountains to see the other corners of the land. Then I'd go see where the enchanted forest is supposed to be. And I'd visit the lake from the legend on the way.
All at once, the cheer drained out of Jack. Oh, the lake. It's fine, I guess. Hiccup paused at the sudden cold in Jack's tone.
You've seen it?
My village is right next to it. Hiccup's eyes widened.
What's it like?
Jack shrugged. Well, it sure is a lake. Very big, trees around it, lots of water. Unresponsive. Jack didn't realize he trailed off until he felt Hiccup stare at him, his brows furrowed in confusion. Jack put on a smile. Nothing noteworthy about it. Hiccup frowned.
Do you miss it? Home, I mean.
Jack felt a deep pang in his heart. He couldn't stop how wistful he sounded. All the time. Hiccup smiled again.
Maybe once everything's done, we can fly you home too.
Jack's mood darkened. Not wanting to direct it at Hiccup, he turned his attention to the mountains, glaring past them to the lake and what was past that as well. He wondered if they were watching him too. I'm not sure that's a good idea. The silence lingered.
Then we won't go anywhere else.
Jack looked back up at Hiccup. It was his turn to furrow his brows.
I mean, we can explore what's on the ground any time, right?
Hiccup grinned, gesturing his hands above them as he searched for the words.
But if we fly high enough into the air, we'll still see it. All corners of the earth, all at once from the sky. We would be like...
Jack felt one corner of his mouth turn up. Like dragons?
Yeah,
Hiccup breathed. His eyes filled with light.
Can you imagine? We'll explore everything and everywhere, like no humans have ever before.
Jack's smile returned in full. Now that sounds fun.
Toothless!
Hiccup hopped down the stones into the cove, barely landing at the bottom before he was tackled over by several armsful of dragon. This time he managed to cover his face before Toothless attacked him with more licks.
Good evening to you too,
Hiccup laughed. Toothless let him stand up and started sniffling Hiccup, tilting his head in question. He was probably smelling the bards after Hiccup had spent all day with them.
I had some help doing some shopping today, but look, I've got enough to make at least another 2 tail fins.
Toothless wasn't paying attention, though. He had moved on to sniffling Hiccup's satchel. Hiccup rummaged through it, pulling out a cookie with a bite taken out of it. Hiccup furrowed his brows. When had Jack found time to sneak that into his bag? It must have been right after Bunny stole Hiccup's satchel bag. Hiccup thought back to that moment, finally recognizing the look Jack had in his eyes. Just like during their conversation on the roof, it was the same warm look Jack gave him under the glider, making the corners of his eyes crinkle. But there was a knowing note in his expression as well. Come to think of it, Jack had also managed to track down Tooth at the same time as playing lookout for Sandy.
Did he intentionally choose Bunny to find him? Toothless sniffed the cookie, then snapped it out of Hiccup's hand, swallowing it whole and licking his lips. Hiccup laughed. This must have been Jack's way of telling him to say hi to Toothless for him. Hiccup smiled.
Let me tell you about our new friends.
For the first time in almost 3 winters, Jack had a dream. There was no frozen lake, no ice or snow. There were no trees, no flowers, nor grass or earth. There was only the mountain, up above an ocean of clouds, in a night sky filled with stars. From the horizon came a great wave of wind that flattened the clouds into an endless blanket. It wrapped around his whole being, a cradle softer than gossamer. There was a voice above him calling his name, a new voice, but one he recognized. He had heard it speak, heard it whisper, heard it mumble and ramble, and had listened to its laughter. He couldn't see him, but Jack knew where to find him. The wind swept him up off his unbound feet and carried him off the mountain, high into the air and closer to the stars, the freedom uplifting his heart. Up and up he flew, the wind carrying him into the sky. He followed Hiccup's voice, soaring to where no one had ever gone before. And in the distance he heard a dragon's roar.